to deliver our welcoming address and introduce our speaker, Professor Song, please.
Dear students, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's my great honor and privilege to introduce Professor James Heckman. Professor Heckman is currently Henry Schu's Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago, where he has been a member of the faculty since 1973. He launched and directed the Center for Economics of Human Development at the University of Chicago. He is also a senior research fellow of the American Bar Foundation. He's a fellow of many prestigious societies, such as the American Academy of Arts and Science, the Econometrics Society, the American Statistical Association, and the International Statistical Institute. As is well known to all of us, he is one of the most important and influential scholars to have graced the economics profession. In year 2000, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for his work on microeconometrics of diversity and heterogeneity, and for establishing a sound causal basis for public policy evaluation. Professor Heckman's contribution to economics and econometrics are extensive. He devoted his professional life to understanding the origins of major social and economic problems related to inequality, social mobility, discrimination, skill formation, and regulations, and to diversifying and evaluating alternative strategies for addressing those problems. His work is deeply rooted at the intersection of economic theory and empirical microeconomics, and he actively collaborates across disciplines to get to the heart of major problems. His recent interdisciplinary research on human development and life cycle skills formation draws on economics, psychology, genetics, epidemiology, and neuroscience to examine the origin of inequality, the determinants of social mobility, and the link among stages of life cycle. Many believe that these contributions may lead to a second Nobel Prize for him, and we look forward to that, sir. Professor Heckman's evolution as an economist was not direct, and experience in his teenage greatly influenced his research interest. In his childhood, he received strong encouragement from his parents to get a college degree. His early life and family history really have great influence on the choice of his studies and as well as the economic theories. Intrigued by the great social changes in the late 50s and the early 60s in the US, he developed a deep fascination with politics, social science, and history. During the high school period, an accidental meeting with Frank Oppenheimer brought Heckman the objective nature of physics and the ability of laws of physics to predict empirical irregularities. The experience led him to appreciate the beauty of experimental science and the pleasure of matching theory to evidence, which established the foundation for his future choice of being an empirical economist. After deciding to become an academic economist and studying economic development, Heckman chose to receive education at the University of Chicago and Princeton. On his graduation, Professor Heckman was first hired at the Columbia University in 1970 as a labor economist. During the 3 years in Columbia, he developed his latent variable framework and became recognized as an econometrician. In 1973, he accepted a job offer as a labor economist and an econometrician at the University of Chicago and has been there ever since. Today, he is one of the most productive and widely cited economists in the profession. He published over 300 papers and 9 books. According to Google Scholar citation, his articles have been cited over 130,000 times in total, and he ranked among the top 3 most cited economists in human history. Today, we are very happy to be able to listen to him. I understand that he just arrived from the United States yesterday, and I thought he had some jet lag, but the moment that he stepped in, we have a very learned discussion about various things, including cancer, psychology, and I can feel that he is full of energy and he has full of excellent ideas in his mind. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome Professor James Heckman.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to thank the Chinese University of Hong Kong for inviting me here today and for the very generous introduction by Professor Sung about my own personal background. I am going to talk about something that I think everybody in this room is interested in, or at least should be interested in, and I certainly welcome questions, and I gather we have some time for questions and answers. So this is an example of where maybe I illustrate the idea that I am now looking at topics that go across disciplines. I think one of the most exciting aspects of research is kind of like, many people now are familiar with Yo-Yo Ma's series called the Silk Road Project, where it's trying to build bridges across cultures. But I think in academic life, something like the Silk Road, cultures, different disciplines meeting, is extremely important for fertilizing research. And so today, my research comes out of this kind of cross-fertilization process. So it's my own travel, if you will, and my personal Silk Road about trying to understand skills. Some of my main interest, as Professor Sung already noted, is on the economics of human development and looking at the structure of what makes people different and what we might do to circumvent differences, or at least to try to circumvent differences that might be avoided or promote opportunities for people. But a key question in that whole process, the whole area of research, is truly understanding how to measure skills. And I think it's a serious question. And I know in Hong Kong, in particular East Asia generally, there has been traditionally a fixation on certain measures of skills. And what I want to talk about today is a much broader inventory for skills. So without further discussion, let me get into this. Oops, now it's suddenly not advancing. Wait. Oh wait, it did advance. Very slowly though. This will take a while. It's really, I mean, I am clicking it, but it's not. Okay, there we go. The introduction. So, when we think about productivity of individual lives, I think many people, especially people in East Asia, in particular in Shanghai, but also I think in Singapore and Hong Kong, think about some of the standard measures of productivity. When we think about individual achievement, it has to do with achievement test scores and IQ. For example, PISA scores are very common. I know many of you are sitting in this room as a result of having high scores on a test somewhere in high school or even in college. And so what I really want to try to explain today is a body of knowledge that's even accepted by the very inventors of the PISA score, that there are many important life skills that aren't well captured. Now that by itself isn't saying much, but it does say that we can think, or should try to think about broader inventories of human achievement. And so I want to argue that focusing solely or mainly on IQ scores or achievement test scores, it really gives an incomplete picture of what schools, families, and communities produce. And it also, I think, leads to a very poor evaluation of what schools are doing, what teachers are doing, and which individuals are likely to succeed. And so I want to talk to you, share with you some lessons from a broader inventory of skills that is being developed. So it's an active process. I don't want to talk about something that happened 50 years ago. I want to talk about something that's very much underway in terms of our discussions today. So what I want to talk about is something which has kind of an old-fashioned sounding name, maybe even a Victorian sounding name, but skills that are associated with what are sometimes called social-emotional skills. what used to be called character skills. These are important and neglected. Health, obviously, important as well. These skills are sometimes called soft skills because they're thought in the past not to be easily measured. But in fact, they are measured. They can be measured, and we have some very hard evidence on them. And the reason why they're interesting is that unlike IQ and some of the measures of cognition, which have received so much attention, that when we think about what are effective targets for intervention and for what schools and what organizations and what families might do, that what we have is more malleability for some of these other skills, more malleability later in life and even into the adult life, and more than just straight cognitive skills. And I'll try to make that precise today. But there's also a lot of economics in this as well. And a lot of this is just organized common sense. But it's not common sense that makes its way into social and economic policy. Namely, when we think about different tasks in life, different tasks require different skills in different levels and proportions. And these differences in skills among people lead to choices that we see people making every day. And this is an example of a principle near and dear to economists' heart, which is the principle of comparative advantage. You go where your relative skill levels lie. But a key notion that comes out of this whole literature is that it's very obsolete to take a view of skills as traits. Even the word skill already suggests, and it's a choice that I deliberately make in that lecture today. But skills are not just traits. They are things that can be changed. And so even IQ can be changed. We can think about many of these things we used to think of either as genetic traits or traits set extremely early. They are, in fact, they are not fixed. But also, and this is a key notion, that when we measure these skills and we measure these abilities, the measurement schemes that we currently use that govern the discussion about whether Shanghai is doing well relative to some other parts of the world, we have to understand that part of what we're measuring are responses to incentives and situations. So it's both incentives and it's situations that are generating a response. And so that instead of thinking about these skills or these traits as somehow fixed attributes of individuals, what we're really measuring is a strategy in response to situations. And I'll make that precise and show you some very vivid examples. And so if we want to get to measures of skills that matter, we also want to understand all the other things that matter in producing the measurements that we use. So that's really my lecture. And if it's all well known, then I can stop and take questions. And you tell me. But let me give you a little bit of background. We're now in 2016. The IQ test is about 100 years old, at least as the modern version of the IQ test. And this was started really by a person trying to estimate who would be successful in school. This was a Frenchman, Benet, who was trying to predict who would succeed in certain schools in France. And this led to a huge literature, which is still very active today, and whole societies like Mensa, where people are deciding who's smart and who's not on the basis of IQ tests. I remember going to a high school reunion a few years ago with some of my former classmates, and it was amazing to me. They were still talking about who was really had a high IQ and who did not have a high IQ 40 or 50 years ago. And it wasn't what the person had done, how successful, who was high IQ. They could still remember the IQ test. Very strange, but it's fixated in our culture. So what I want to do is just kind of review that. So this concept of cognition, when we think about it, is really a product of early 20th century psychology. And this has been broadened, but it's still the center of a hierarchy of what are called correlated traits. But I'm an economist, and when economists ask about predictive theories, we ask how well do these traits or these measures predict something that matters. And if you look at a lot of the work in psychometrics, which is the study of these tests, IQ, achievement, and other tests, there's a certain circularity. That the validation in many of these tests is done by using other measures, either other tests or grades or other kinds of very closely related measurement systems. But to me, what's really relevant is what succeeds in life. Who's making successful earnings? who's basically succeeding, what health choices are, how we might succeed across different dimensions of life. And so, even though IQ was originally designed to predict performance in school, and it's moderately predictive, as I will show you, it still is the case that there are many other important predictors of things like who succeeds in school and also who succeeds in life. And much of psychology is focused on this kind of circular notion of validating a test by some other test. Now, there are some exceptions in the field called personnel psychology. The psychologists are trying to screen who's successful, who would be a good job applicant, and so forth. Then they actually do look at some of these broader measures. And more recently, political scientists and economists have used the measures of achievement tests, the so-called Armed Forces Qualifying Test, to essentially predict success in life. And I'll show you some of those results. So let me show you what psychologists, this is taken directly out of a standard work in psychology. And at the core of this is a hierarchical notion that at the center we have something called general intelligence. And then there are aspects of intelligence that have been developed. So nobody says that IQ is like a single number, or there is an IQ number, but it's not just a single notion. That there are other notions, mathematical reasoning, visual perception, aspects of how well you remember, perceptual properties, and other notions. And a distinction is sometimes made between crystallized and fluid intelligence. So the crystallized intelligence is like acquired intelligence, maybe practiced intelligence. So when people get older, they generally have higher crystallized intelligence. That's the theory of why you should keep judges in office for many years. And fluid intelligence is what many of you have. It's associated with being young, being smart, and picking up questions. You know, just the Raven's IQ test is an example of that. So there are these different notions, but G turns out to be correlated with virtually all of these components. Huge literature on this. Now, associated with the IQ test is another test, and that's different. And this is what the PISA test is, and this is what a lot of the tests are that you've taken. These are the tests you take that try to show at the end of each school year, or maybe the end of a whole school sequence, like at the end of secondary school or the end of primary school, what your general knowledge is. And so the IQ test was really based on the idea that a trait was fixed, and you were capturing a trait which was really thought originally to be genetic. But now, the idea of the achievement test was to capture what schools added to the capacities of students. So it had a dynamic theory. It wasn't capturing a trait. It was trying to capture what was relevant in, quote, real-world tasks. But it was a paper and pencil test. You've all taken PISA tests, and people use these tests. But even early on, by the very inventors of these tests, and this guy was actually the Dean of Social Sciences at the University of Chicago in 1940, and he's the one who actually, he and some other colleagues were the ones who developed the very PISA test and a lot of the standardized achievement tests. But what he said is really what I'm going to conclude. So I could really stop my talk almost with this quotation. And he says, well, we lean heavily on written exams. And he was the official examiner at the University of Chicago for many years before he went on to the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. But he points out that we lean heavily on written exams, but we could use many other appraisal devices. And so he's suggesting things like what activities students are doing, teacher reports, parent reports, and so forth. But the fact of the matter was, on purely technological grounds in the early 1950s, precisely because of the card reader and the development of early versions of the computer technology, the short answer, achievement test, which we've all taken, became extremely popular and became enshrined in culture and is there today. So literally, from the very day the founder of this test was questioning what was done. But nonetheless, I think still today we heavily rely on written exams. So I want to talk about that practice. So I want to return to this insight and talk about what we can think of more generally about human potential. Now, psychologists have given a lot of thought to this, and this is where I come in. I've been doing a lot of work over the years with various psychologists, in particular personality psychologist Angela Duckworth, who recently wrote a best-selling book, I should say, on grit, and I'll come to that. But we've had a lot of conferences at Chicago where we're trying to understand what these traits are and what are these skills. So initially, when people wanted to think of traits other than IQ, they thought of very broad measures. So they went to dictionaries, in this case the Webster's English Dictionary. Some of the earliest notions were to take traits, all different descriptors of people. So they had as many as 20,000 different characteristics of people. That's unmanageable, of 20,000 different characteristics. And so recently, and I mean quite recently, in the last 20 years, psychologists have settled, personality psychologists, have settled on what's called the Big Five. The Big Five is based on factor analysis of measures of personality. So without describing it, it's really a statistical analysis of assessments, sometimes self-reported assessments, of various aspects of behavior. Now the one thing that's interesting, let me show you what the Big Five are, just to give you some examples. The Big Five, the acronym for Big Five is OCEAN, the English acronym. So OCEAN stands for openness to experience, which is one of the traits, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And each of these has facets within those five. So those are the Big Five. And so there's nothing like a G, though. It's not like there's a single trait that is correlated with these five. These are five separate traits, or five separate measurements that are taken. And they themselves have, so each of these you can explore. And here's an example. I don't know if you can see it so well, but for example, openness to experience, that's what the concept means. And it has what I call facets. And so there are these facets that are made. These are all either self-descriptions or observer descriptions of individuals. And sometimes tests are given, but generally speaking, this is the way it is. And there are childhood versions of these traits. So we can think about these traits, and they have an obvious sense of conscientiousness, openness to experience, extroversion, agreeableness, and so forth. But there are a lot of different subtraits, and some of the recent work has actually suggested that certain of these subtraits within these larger frameworks, the Big Five domains, maybe are more predictive than the overall aggregate. So there are a lot of different measurement systems out there. They're predictive of many outcomes, but it turns out that these Big Five traits are still not all that predictive. I'll show you in a minute how predictive they are, just give you some data. But the important thing, and this is really the important thing, is that the Big Five, and many of these measures in psychological traits, are defined without any reference to the context in which they're measured. So this is the idea of a trait. It's kind of like, this is me. I am me. I'm always conscientious. You can imagine, how conscientious am I in the presence of certain incentives? How conscientious am I? And so this is really where the frontier is, and I'll show you how important these considerations really are. I will point out, and this is somewhat gratuitous, and I shouldn't really develop this since this is really developed more for me than by me, but there are analogs in Chinese culture. It turns out when people try to take these Big Five inventories to Germany or to China, they find that there are some counterparts, but typically not exactly the five. So sometimes people find Big Five being mapped into Big Seven. There's another Big Seven trait that has been suggested for Chinese culture. So there isn't a sense, and then also some of these other traits, the 8 virtues, are sometimes matched into the Big Five. What's happening, you'll laugh in some sense. And this really suggests that the evidence is here, that we really do have a lot of work to do. So here's a facet of trying to see how the Big Five factor model maps into some existing schemes from either historical figures in Chinese history or some of the more recent efforts to try to come up with inventories of Chinese that are more Chinese culturally based. So there is an issue of how general those traits are. But a big question that comes out, and this is a very important divide that shows up in behavioral economics, it shows up in psychology, and shows up all around, is what's called the person-situation debate. And this is an extreme example, what I'm going to call the identification problem. And so, in one extreme case, social psychologists have argued that the variation across people and behavior is not a consequence of individual traits. It's not like I am conscientious or not. It has strictly to do with the situation I'm placed in. So I'm placed in a situation where I'm under heavy scrutiny, I'm being observed, I have strong incentives to be conscientious, I'll be conscientious. And in fact, Michelle, a famous personality psychologist, famous psychologist, wrote a paper almost 50 years ago now, in which he said that basically IQ is a fairly stable trait, but the idea that there are stable traits and personality traits is completely untenable. So that really, this is all situationally determined. So I'm not me. There's not a me. There's a me in a situation. And what's interesting and somewhat ironic about that, I don't know if many of you have heard about the marshmallow test. Everybody's heard about the marshmallow test. You've heard about it. Well, it's this test that Michelle gave. And he gave it for completely unrelated reasons. He took these little kids. You can go to YouTube and look it up and see that the actual original tests were videotaped and they're posted. Little kids were given these marshmallows. And they were told, look, if you wait for 20 more minutes, you'll get a second marshmallow. But don't eat the first marshmallow. Okay? And so he looked at the kids struggling, and some kids ate the marshmallow, some didn't. Now what was interesting is that about 20 years after Michelle wrote this statement, there's no such thing as a stable trait, he found out that the kids who waited for the marshmallow were the ones who graduated from high school, had much lower crime, were going to college, were getting higher earnings, and on and on and on. They've been followed now. And so actually Michelle, ironically, about the time that he was writing this, identified at least some evidence for a stable personality trait. But nonetheless, the debate is really valid. It's a valid debate. And so more recently, my colleague at the University of Chicago, Richard Thaler, has suggested that there really isn't a stable. And so this is a very non-trivial issue in behavioral economics and in economics. Just what is it we're measuring, and should we classify individuals, or should we classify individuals only relative to the situation? That's the question. That's a really big question. So what do we know? So I don't want to bore you with too many numbers, and that's one of an occupational hazard, and one for me in particular. I do a lot of data analysis, and I tend to think that everybody else likes to do it too. And I always learn the hard way that nobody does. Very few do. They're hardcore. But nonetheless, assuming I have a few hardcore, I'll show you some data. So there is a lot of evidence, though, across many outcomes, that there are measured personality traits are as predictive, if not more predictive, than standard measures of cognition. But situation matters. So that's not really basic. But there's mounting evidence, the biological basis, that personality is an important determinant of behavior. And this also shows up in studies that have been done in behavioral genetics, showing heritability, and then studies that have been done how brain structures altered through accidents, through some kinds of disease and the like, have fundamentally changed aspects of what we think of as personality. So there does seem to be a biological basis. But the question is, what exactly is being measured? And so I want to talk about these new approaches and what we learn, what we think about them. So instead of thinking about a test as capturing traits or skills, I want to make the following, what I think is a commonplace but extremely important observation. And that is that every psychological measurement you use, whether it's a PISA score, an IQ test, a personality test, is always a measurement on performance on some performance on a task. It's a measure of how well. And so my colleague, well, general colleague, he's at the University of Illinois, but he's close enough and we interact often, Brent Roberts, has written that personality is a stable trait about enduring thoughts and feelings. So this is a kind of verbal definition of what personality traits are. But what I want to put forward today is a notion of a task-based framework for identifying and measuring skills. And so I think the distinction between tasks and tests is artificial. The IQ test is a test. And I can alter IQ. In fact, one of the famous experiments that was done in this area was a study that was looking at black-white differences in IQ in the United States some 40 years ago. And it turns out that if you look in terms of standard deviation on a Raven's IQ test, blacks are one standard deviation at that time, or one standard deviation below the average white measurement in the United States. Now it's 2/3 of the standard deviation, but there's still a significant difference. But what it turned out was that if you took kids and did some randomized trials that were done on school children, and you took kids, and you basically took black kids and white kids, and you took black kids, and you basically gave these kids one small candy for each successful answer, each correct answer on the IQ test. On that particular administration of the IQ test, the black-white gap vanished. And it turned out that the response was greatest among children who were least conscientious. So in terms of what economists like to think of as a supply function, what happened is the most conscientious kids were already working at full capacity. They already took this very seriously. The less conscientious kids had to be incentivized, and you could reduce black-white IQ gap, at least for that administration of a test. And there are many, many other examples. We actually have some studies that we're doing now in China, looking at variation of tests and showing what the responses are. So I would just make this diagram, put it through here. This is as much mathematics. I was told not to use any mathematics, so I'm not. This is a diagram, call it a graph, I guess, if you want to be fancy, but it's really very simple. But what it's saying is that we only have outputs on tasks. All tests are outputs on tasks. And we want to try to infer what skills are. But we think, what are the efforts? Effort, incentives and motivation, and situation and constraints are all affecting the outputs on a task. So I give you an IQ test. There recently is a book out suggesting that if I give starving people an IQ test, they do much less well than if they're well fed. I personally don't consider that a big insight, but that's the point is that would put a situation and constraint. So we're starving somebody, or if I turn the heat up to 150 degrees in a room when you're taking an IQ test, my prediction will be your IQ is going to be much worse than if I gave you normal temperature. So I think we really have to think about it, but realize that right now, what we're doing is we're looking at one graph. We're saying skills go to the output on the test. And then we're saying then the output on that task is a measure of skill. So we're inverting it. We're saying not just one-way cost and not controlling for the other aspects. So let me show you what we can say. So what I want to argue is instead of relying exclusively or mainly on self-reported measures, I think there are better approaches. And this I want to talk about. This is what Tyler was talking about in that quotation. So when we think about behaviors more generally, we have teacher reports. And it turns out that grades, even though grades are frequently discredited as saying they're biased, the teachers have certain favorites and so forth and so on, although that can be eliminated by averaging grades over multiple teachers, but nonetheless, you say there might be some bias in grades. Grades turn out to be more predictive even of success in college than things like IQ or achievement tests. Past behaviors and choices are manifestations of the same underlying skills. And more recently, economists have been eliciting these measures of preferences and of psychological parameters from both field experiments and controlled trials in laboratory settings. And so this has now become an important tool in shaping and understanding how we can think more generally about the structure of what human preferences are. So what I want to do then, in terms of this diagram, is suggesting how in various laboratory settings and in various, using both behaviors that we observe and experiments that we can conduct, and placing students in different situations, varying the incentives, varying essentially why they would work or not work, and changing the situation. It's that principle of variation which will allow us to extract what the true skill is. So that's really the research task. So let me just give you a few quick facts. I already told you this, that IQ tests and achievement tests are typically done in validating in a circular fashion. So you go to the test and say, look, the AFQT is validated against the DAT, or the SAT is validated against some other test. That doesn't tell me anything. What I'm interested in is how successful people will be in various real-world tasks. So what I want to argue is real-world situations. So let me just skip through a few slides. And we have a paper which I'm working, which is just coming out actually in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences with these co-authors. And let me just share with you some findings. So we can find, for example, that even though sometimes we conflate the idea that IQ and grades are the same and IQ and achievement tests are the same, these are really measuring different concepts. And so what's the difference? And what it turns out is that there are correlations among these factors. And so I won't go through the extensive tables. These are different data sets that have different measures, but there are correlations. But the only important thing I would extract is the correlations are far from one. These are data in Europe and data in the United States and data in the United Kingdom. And so you do get differences in correlations. The measures differ, but they're still, and so there is a positive correlation, but they're not anywhere near one. So it's not that we can ask the question, well, if we actually look at something like an achievement test score, we actually ran an experiment, we ran some studies at a school in Holland. We can actually ask, well, we have an achievement score. It's called the DAT. It's not important, the name. It's very close to something like the SAT or the Armed Forces Qualifying Test. What you find here in this school is you can explain about 20% of the variance in the achievement test if you put in IQ, Big Five, and Duckworth's grit. Grit is not explaining a tremendous amount here, you can see, in terms of achievement test, but it is bundled in with the Big Five. It's very closely related to conscientiousness. So what does this say? Achievement tests, if we put all these factors in, we explain about 20% of the achievement test. Far from a perfect correlation, suggesting there are many other factors going on in the achievement test. If you ask what explains grades in school, well, grades in school themselves, if we put all these factors together, explaining about 7% of the variability across students. And what does IQ explain? About 1%, very small. And if we ask now, what is if we put all these together, we get about 7% again. And grit plays a bigger role. But the role that grit plays depends on the gender. Turns out grit plays a very strong role for women, but not for men. So these factors seem to be going all over the place. This is showing you what the different factors contribute. Probably not so important to dwell on this, since I have used up a big chunk of my talk already. Oops, I think I know what I'm doing wrong. Yes, I'm pointing it, not at this. Okay. Okay. So now we can ask ourselves, we get similar findings. I'll just verbally summarize that across multiple data sets. So instead of dwelling on that, what I want to argue is that personality predicts grades. And in fact, in some sense, personality, as you saw, and this is true across multiple data sets, is a stronger predictor than actually IQ. But if you look at it for grades, if you look at something like achievement test, IQ is a stronger predictor. Okay? So here I'm still staying kind of internally. But now what we're really interested in, at least I am as an economist, is how these measures at all predict success later in life, not just how well you do in school. Now it turns out, as I mentioned earlier, that if you ask what's predicting who does well in school, the achievement test scores are not as important as grades. High school grades, secondary school grades are more predictive. Why? I think I already showed you in part. Because grades are capturing some measures of conscientiousness. How hard people are willing to learn and how hard they are willing to work. So the question we can ask, how powerful is IQ? So here's an example from British data. It looks very busy, but it actually has a very simple story. This is looking at wages, education, body mass index, number of arrests, life satisfaction, different measures. This first bar is essentially telling you how much of the variability across people in wages, and these people are now in their early 40s, and you ask how much is explained here by IQ? Not that much. So the famous story is, if you're so smart, how come you're not so rich? And I think that's kind of, here's the answer. Here you can also see that IQ and personality plays a bigger role, but it's hardly the whole story. So if you bundle all of these things together, IQ and personality, then you're going to get a little bit more, but you're still going to find that you put all these things together, you're getting these measures. But what you can see is that two things. IQ and these other factors aren't playing all that much. Now, by design, remember, IQ was designed to explain who was doing well in school, right? It was that was Binet's original reason for developing the IQ test. So IQ is not a bad predictor relative to effect on earnings. But if you look, for example, at measures of personality, it's more important. So Duckworth's term, grit, or conscientiousness, which is really the same concept, is actually really more important about who's succeeding in school, how many years of school. If you look at body mass index, you look at a lot of these other predictors, you're going to see that these social-emotional skills are predictive. And this is true across. But the other thing to notice here is that we put all of these measures together. we're still not explaining very much of all these dimensions. And so this is where I use the term somewhat facetiously and maybe pretentiously. This is like our social science version of dark matter. There's a lot out there that we don't fully understand. And this is what makes it an interesting research area, but makes it especially important to understand when we start measuring students and start measuring countries on these dimensions. We should understand, A, how imperfect they are, how other predictors are probably better than those measures, and that we could actually do better. Okay, and we need to do better. So we can then look at a bunch of other data sets, and we get a similar finding that IQ is not such a strong predictor of things. This is a very different measure of a Wisconsin data set, looking again now at midlife and things like mental health and so forth, physical health. IQ is not that strong a predictor. And you can look at other, a question? I mean, happy to take questions. Oh, okay. So the one predictor that everybody agrees is important among all these so-called big five measures is this measure of conscientiousness. And even people like Arthur Jensen, who made a life out of talking about the importance of IQ, said if there's any personality trait that's predictive, it's conscientiousness. And that's really what Duckworth has talked about and what has been found in many, many studies. If you want to ask about the topic that most people are always interested in, namely how long they're going to live, and we look at the big five, we can see that in IQ, we can see that IQ is a much weaker, so I shouldn't say much weaker, but a weaker predictor than conscientiousness. But unfortunately, none of these is very good predictors of mortality. And we get similar findings across other dimensions of performance, but I should skip past. Personality and crime, we can see that the big five correlate in ways. Delinquents are relatively high in extroversion. Okay, the non-delinquents relatively low. Agreeableness not so high for juvenile delinquents. Conscientiousness not so high for delinquents. And so there is a kind of, quote, an obvious relationship, but the fact of the matter is that the predictive power is still open. So what's the implication for public policy? That measures of personality predict achievement test scores and grades above and beyond IQ scores. And that when we're measuring these scores, and we're looking at things like, Hanishek and others are talking about using IQ or using achievement tests as a measure of the human capital of a country, this is a very limited measure. And we can do better. And we have done better, and we're in the process of doing better. And so why it's important? Because these achievement tests are widely used. They're used to measure traits required for success in school and life. And many people look at the differences in test scores to make the black-white achievement gap. And so in some sense, we're looking at only one dimension of an important set of dimensions, which we can quantify and which we now know to be very important. So this is where it takes me to the rest of it. There are a lot of other examples, but I don't have time to go through those. So how do we think about this? How do we think about these traits? Well, this is what another key point I want to try to make. And that is they shouldn't think of them as traits anymore. They're strategies. So if you know any game theory or just have a notion of what game theory is, in game theory people are trying to think of how they strategize, how they respond to situations. They bring their own capacities, their own resources, but they're also involved in interactions with other people. And the interaction could be the interaction with a test. It could also be literally a social interaction with a group of people. And so I want to think of personality as a strategy, and it's an emergent property of a system. And what I want to do is think about what the issues are. So let me just review. So there's a really important question that leads us into behavioral economics and leads us into a lot of open issues in economics and behavioral economics and social science generally. How do we interpret personality measures? We can think of these things as preference traits. So for example, a lot of work in behavioral economics will talk about anomalies in human behavior. We'll say, okay, some people have loss aversion. We know that's been pretty well documented by Kahneman and Tversky. And many other certain kinds of biases that appear to be cognitive biases. That's a kind of standard approach. But there's another way to think about this. We can think of these as constraints. That individuals, for example, who are very fearful, who are basically not open to experience, are much less able to acquire knowledge, much less willing to engage, and they therefore don't benefit from some of the opportunities that life can offer. And then the expectations. People talk about differences. So personality just may be a measure about expectations that people have, pro or con about situations. I want to talk about these ideas bundled in the concept of a strategy. But again, I want to capture this notion and go back to this diagram, that literally everything we measure is affected by incentives and motivation, situations and constraints. And we need to understand that, and we need to standardize for that, and understand that in placing all of our measurements on in isolate. So it's a huge measurement challenge, but it's one that's being addressed. So as I said earlier, the standard practice in psychology is to basically equate the skills to the output on the task. But in fact, that's only part of the story. And isolating that story is what's going on. So I'll skip some of these other models. But there is work now, and this is by some behavioral economists and by some economists mainstream. The dividing line is somewhat arbitrary. But there's work that says economists have a system of preferences that is somewhat different from the Big Five. I haven't really mentioned these, but I'm showing you these now. So for example, things like time preference. How much are you willing today to postpone consumption, but in exchange for getting a bigger bonus tomorrow? The marshmallow type calculation. How risk averse are you? How ambiguity averse are you? How much are you willing to cope with uncertainty of a type where we don't even know the probabilities of a risk situation? Their social preferences. Are we altruistic in individuals? Do we have reciprocity? So the question is, can we map these common economic time preference parameters and social preference parameters and risk aversion parameters into the Big Five? And that's an open research agenda. And fortunately, there's some work on that that's been done by my colleague and friend Armand Falk with Thomas Doman and his co-authors. And without going into the details, since I'm running very low on time, let me just say that several experiments were taken in which individuals were given Big Five measures of the conventional type. But experiments were also conducted. So people were done where they were given lists of choices between a certain amount of money today and a certain amount of money tomorrow. That's a measure of time preference, okay? And so you can actually elicit that through laboratory experiments among students. You can do this for similar references, parameters for risk, reciprocity, negative, positive reciprocity, trust, and altruism. So these are measures that behavioral economists more generally have come up with. And the question is, how correlated are they? So when we measure these things, either through experiments or through self-reported questions, you can ask somebody in a pencil and paper test, at what point do you become indifferent between, waiting today, or I get an immediate payoff 6 months from now of, say, 50 cents. If I give myself a Hong Kong dollar, I get $1.50, but I do that in 6 months, postpone that to 9 months. And when do I become indifferent? Well, without going into every detail of every table, the fact of the matter is that when these measures of personality that are measured by the Big Five are measured with the measures of preferences that economists use, there are correlations, although sometimes they're surprising. I want to go through every one of the correlations, but they're far from high. It's not like I can say risk aversion is really just aversion of conscientiousness or openness to experience. These are very different dimensions. And the same thing is true however we elicit these preferences. And when we look at preference measures elicited this way, we can also look at outcomes in the same way I looked at outcomes before. And we can look at measures of Big Five and other measures. There's also a measure that I didn't show you with IQ. But what we find is that, again, we're not explaining a lot of outcomes. Subjective health reporting, life satisfaction, wages, unemployment. So we have the same general pattern that they predict, but they're not fully predictive. But it seems like there's a larger space of characteristics. So the Big Five, taken by psychologists, and the Big Five and the dimensions of economists are explaining different dimensions. So I'll just suggested this paper by Becker and his co-authors. So then the question is, how do we succeed? So I already talked about the study about reference bias. And let me just conclude with a discussion of how the subject is going forward. there is an issue about the stability of these things that we measure. So how stable is IQ over the life of the person? It turns out that after about age 10, 12, pre-puberty years, you can learn more, generally speaking, for healthy individuals. There's a very high rank correlation. Your position in the IQ distribution at age 10, 12, and 13 is pretty highly correlated to your position at age 23, 24, and on to later life, okay? We think that fluid intelligence is generally decreasing, crystallized intelligence is increasing, generally G is fairly stable. That's one thing about cognition. What about the other preference parameters? Well, I'll just show you. There's a trait called social dominance, how much you interact with the larger world, which increases with age. But there's no question. Conscientiousness tends to improve with age. Openness to experience opens up and then starts to diminish with age. Agreeableness goes up, and stability. And we get various kinds of notion of stability. So so what happens is, yes, these traits are not traits in the usual sense. There's another process going on. The process is one of human development, and that's another whole lecture. I'm not going to give you much of a story. But it turns out that we can then change. We can even change IQ. If we intervene early enough and with intensive enough interventions, we can alter the IQ of individuals. We can also change these non-cognitive traits. And it turns out that correlating the evidence from neuroscience along with the evidence from personality psychology and from other fields, what we find is that consistent with the slowly developing prefrontal cortex of human beings into the late teens and early 20s, what we find is that there are a fair degree of plasticity and mobility. The rank correlation in measures of conscientiousness, agreeableness, and a lot of these traits are fairly low. You actually can find that things can be manipulated, things can be influenced in a positive way and a negative way through interventions and mentoring and so forth. So the fact is there is dynamics, and we have a whole subject in which you're trying to understand the dynamics. In fact, that's how I got into this to start with. I'm actually more interested in the dynamics